Zara sat on the edge of the barren hill, overlooking her family's modest dwelling on Zeltron 5, a small moon orbiting the distant gas giant Zelthar. The faint blue hue of the planet reflected in her luminous eyes, giving them an otherworldly glow. Her azure skin shimmered in the dim light of the setting sun, while the faint breeze carried the metallic scent of the nearby scrap fields. Zara had always loved these quiet moments, when the world around her seemed to pause, letting her dream of something greater than the life her family led. But those dreams felt distant now, out of reach. The tension in her home had been building for weeks. Her parents whispered in corners, and her older siblings, once boisterous and full of life, had become sullen and distant. The debt collectors had been coming more frequently, their threats growing harsher. Zara knew things were dire, but she still believed her family would find a way to pull through like they always had. That hope shattered one evening when her eldest brother, Lano, returned from a meeting in town, his face pale and his fists clenched. "They're giving us one last chance," he announced grimly. "We have a week to pay or they'll take everything." Zara watched her parents exchange a fearful glance, and something inside her twisted with dread. "We'll find a way," her mother said, though her voice shook with uncertainty. But as the days passed, Zara noticed the looks. Her family avoided her gaze, speaking in low tones when she entered a room. One night, she overheard them discussing something she couldn't quite believe. "She's young," her father's voice trembled. "She'll survive?" "We don't have a choice," Lano whispered back. "It's her or all of us." The next day, they took her to the market under the pretense of selling off some scrap. Zara, sensing something off, kept her distance, observing the way her father's eyes never quite met hers. When they arrived at the spaceport, her suspicions crystallized into horror. There, standing beside the slaver's ship, was a tall, sinister figure in a sleek, dark coat. His cold eyes scanned the crowd with disinterest, pausing when they landed on Zara. Her family didn't meet her gaze as the slaver approached. "You must be Zara," the man said, his voice dripping with false kindness. "Your family has made a necessary arrangement for the good of all." Zara's heart pounded in her chest as realization crashed over her. "No," she whispered, stepping back, her pulse racing. "This isn't happening." But it was. Her mother wept quietly, clutching a bundle of credits to her chest, while her father looked away, his shoulders hunched in shame. Lano, the one who had always looked out for her, couldn't even bring himself to speak. He simply stood there, his jaw clenched tight, fists trembling at his sides. Zara's legs felt like lead as the slaver's men approached. She wanted to run, to scream, but the betrayal from her own flesh and blood paralyzed her. She felt a pair of cold metal shackles snap around her wrists, binding her future to a fate she couldn't escape. Her family had sold her into slavery. As she was dragged toward the ship, Zara's mind reeled. How could they do this? How could they choose their survival over hers? She had been the light of their home, the one who always dreamed of something better, and now those dreams had been ripped away. Her eyes locked with her mother's one last time, silently begging for an explanation, a plea for this nightmare to end. But her mother only wept harder. The ramp of the slaver's ship closed behind her with a metallic hiss, sealing her fate. Inside, she was thrown into a holding cell alongside other captives, some alien, some human, all sharing the same haunted, hollow expressions. Zara leaned against the cold steel walls, her heart pounding, her body trembling with shock. The ship shuddered as it lifted off the surface of Zeltron 5, leaving behind everything she had ever known. The hours stretched into days as the ship carried them through hyperspace, moving toward a dark, distant future. Zara refused to cry, even as despair gnawed at her insides. She vowed not to let the slavers break her spirit, even though they had already taken her freedom. The fear that gripped her heart was slowly giving way to a simmering anger. She wouldn't just survive. She would escape. In the dark confines of the ship, she listened to the whispers of the other captives, stories of other worlds, tales of cruelty, and occasionally flickers of hope. There was talk of resistance groups, outlaws and rebels who fought to free the enslaved, to dismantle the very system that had imprisoned them. But these were distant dreams, and Zara knew it. For now, all she could do was endure and wait for the right moment. When the ship finally landed on a remote planet at the fringes of the galactic trade zone, Zara's shackles were replaced with an energy collar, and she was led out onto a dusty auction block. She blinked against the harsh sunlight, trying to steel herself against the leering crowd that had gathered. This was where her new life would begin, one as a commodity to be bought and sold. The auctioneer's voice droned on, calling out her attributes like she was an object, not a person. But just as Zara's rage threatened to boil over, she noticed something, or rather, someone among the bidders, a human male, not dressed in the fine robes of the wealthy or the hard armor of the mercenaries, but in simple, worn clothes. He didn't look at her with hunger or cruelty. Instead, there was something different in his eyes, something that flickered with compassion. His hand rose, quietly, amid the loud calls from the wealthier buyers. The auctioneer's gaze briefly wavered before accepting the bid. In moments, Zara was handed over to him, her fate tied to this human stranger. As the chains fell away, Zara's heart raced, torn between distrust and the faintest flicker of hope. Was this just another cruel twist of her fate? Or had the stars, in some strange way, just offered her a second chance? She stepped forward, unsure of what to expect, and met the human's gaze. He looked down at her, not with ownership, but with a strange sense of relief. "I'm Tom," he said quietly, his voice steady, kind. "You're free now, and we're going to get out of here." Zara didn't know whether to trust him, but in that moment, standing in the dusty courtyard of an alien world with the weight of betrayal and chains still heavy on her shoulders, she allowed herself to believe, just for a moment, that maybe, just maybe, freedom was within reach. And with that fragile spark of hope, Zara stepped into the unknown once more, this time not as a prisoner, but as a survivor. The stars beyond the chains were waiting. The harsh sunlight of the alien planet dimmed as Tom led Zara away from the auction block. The marketplace buzzed with activity around them, slavers shouting out bids, buyers bartering for exotic goods, and the low hum of starships in the distance. Zara's wrists still ached from the shackles, her skin bruised from the rough handling. Despite being freed from the chains, the weight of her situation clung to her like a suffocating fog. Tom's grip on her arm was firm but gentle as he steered her through the chaotic crowd, avoiding prying eyes. He didn't speak, but his presence felt different. There was no malice in his actions, none of the coldness or superiority she had expected from someone who had just purchased her freedom. Still, Zara remained wary. She had trusted before. Her family, those who claimed to love her, and that had ended in betrayal. Why should this human be any different? They turned into a narrow alleyway, hidden from the main streets, where the noise of the market faded into a low murmur. Tom stopped and turned to face her, his brown eyes searching her face. For the first time, Zara got a good look at him. His clothes were worn and dusted with dirt, his face lined with exhaustion. Yet there was a quiet strength in his demeanor, something that set him apart from the harshness of the world they were in. "You don't need to be afraid," he said softly, breaking the silence between them. "I'm not like them." Zara narrowed her eyes, stepping back, putting a cautious distance between them. "You bought me," she said, her voice low and bitter. "How are you any different from the rest?" Tom's face tightened for a moment, a flicker of pain crossing his features. He took a breath, then shook his head. "I understand why you don't trust me, but I didn't buy you to keep you as a slave. I bought you because I know what it's like to be trapped, to have no choices. And I can't leave someone to that fate." Zara's heart pounded as she studied him, still unsure. The memory of being sold by her own family was fresh, and the idea of trusting anyone again seemed impossible. But there was something in Tom's words, in the way he spoke, not like a master, but like someone who had suffered too. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "My name's Tom," he repeated gently. I was an engineer. From Earth. He hesitated, glancing down at his hands before continuing. A few years ago, I was working on a colony out in the Outer Rim, a place not too different from this. One day, a ship arrived, pirates. They raided the colony, took anything of value, including me. I've been a slave ever since. Zara blinked, her guard faltering slightly. His story was familiar. Too familiar. She had heard similar tales whispered among the other slaves during the journey to this forsaken planet. The galaxy was vast, and its dark corners were filled with people who profited from the misery of others. How did you escape? Zara asked, her suspicion still lingering, though it was slowly being replaced by curiosity. I didn't, Tom admitted, his jaw tightening. Not fully, anyway. I was fortunate enough to be sold to someone who needed my skills. I wasn't treated well, but I wasn't kept in chains either. I worked, fixed their ships, built their tech. They thought they had broken me, that I wouldn't try to run. But I've been planning my escape ever since. He looked at her, his eyes filled with quiet determination. I don't plan on staying here, and I don't plan on leaving you behind. Zara's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to believe him, to grasp at the hope he was offering, but her heart was still raw with the pain of betrayal. She had been abandoned once. Why wouldn't it happen again? How do I know you won't just sell me to the next slaver? She asked, her voice sharp, her pain bubbling to the surface. Tom's gaze softened, and he shook his head. You don't, he said honestly. You have no reason to trust me. But I swear to you, Zara, I'll do whatever I can to get us both out of here. No one deserves to be trapped like this. For a long moment, they stood there in silence. Zara's heart raced as she battled with herself, her mind swirling with doubt and fear. But beneath it all, there was something small, a spark of hope that refused to die, no matter how much she tried to smother it. Why? She finally asked. Why help me? You don't even know me. Tom smiled faintly, though there was sadness in his eyes. Because I know what it feels like to be left behind, to be forgotten. He paused, as if weighing his next words carefully. No one should have to face that alone. Zara bit her lip, her emotions a storm inside her. She still didn't fully trust him. How could she? But there was something in his words that resonated with her, something that tugged at the walls she had built around her heart. She had no one else. I want to believe you, Zara whispered, looking away. But I can't be a slave again. You won't be, Tom said firmly. Not if I have anything to say about it. The conviction in his voice was like a lifeline, pulling her from the depths of her despair. Slowly she nodded, her decision made, though cautiously. She would follow him, but her heart remained guarded. If there was any chance of freedom, she would take it. But she wouldn't let herself be fooled again. Tom let out a breath, visibly relieved by her agreement. Good. There's a shipyard not far from here, he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. I've been working there, fixing ships. I know the layout. If we're careful, we can steal one and get out of the system before anyone notices. Steal a ship, Zara repeated, her eyes widening. It's our best chance, Tom replied, his expression grim. If we stay here too long, someone will notice you're missing, or worse, they'll come after me for helping you. We need to leave tonight. Zara's heart raced at the thought of escape. She had dreamed of this moment ever since the chains had been placed around her wrists, but the reality of it seemed daunting. Still, she had no other options. It was either trust Tom or remain trapped in this endless nightmare. Okay, she said, her voice steady, despite the fear gnawing at her. Let's do it. Tom gave her a small, encouraging smile before turning to lead the way. They moved swiftly through the narrow alleys, keeping to the shadows, avoiding the watchful eyes of the guards and slavers that roamed the marketplace. The tension between them was thick, but there was also an unspoken understanding. For now, they were allies, bound by their shared desire for freedom. As they approached the shipyard, the distant hum of engines and the glow of docking lights filled the air. Zara's pulse quickened. This was it. the first step toward escaping the life that had been forced upon her. She glanced at Tom, who was scanning the yard with a practiced eye. "Stay close," he whispered, his voice low and urgent. "We need to move quickly." Zara nodded, her heart pounding as they slipped into the shadows of the towering starships. The path ahead was dangerous, but for the first time since her capture, she felt the faintest flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in weeks: hope. As the two of them moved toward their chance at freedom, Zara couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, this human who had saved her might be the key to her survival, and perhaps something more. For the first time, the shackles of her fate didn't feel so heavy. The stars, it seemed, were beginning to align in her favor. The shipyard was an immense, sprawling labyrinth of docking bays and cargo platforms. Towering starships loomed like silent giants in the night, their metal hulls reflecting the dim glow of the station's lights. The hum of machinery and the occasional shout from workers echoed in the distance, but for the most part, the shipyard was quiet. It was the perfect time for an escape. Zara's heart pounded in her chest as she and Tom moved through the shadows, keeping low and out of sight. Every step they took felt like a risk. Like any second a guard or a slaver might catch sight of them, and their slim chance at freedom would vanish. She could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken urgency in Tom's every movement. He knew this place well, had studied it, waited for this moment. But even so, they were walking a razor's edge. "This way," Tom whispered, gesturing toward a row of smaller, less conspicuous ships. They ducked behind a stack of crates, waiting as a group of mechanics passed by, their voices low and distracted. Zara's gaze darted around, scanning every corner for danger, her body ready to spring into action at the slightest hint of a threat. She hadn't felt this alive, this on edge, since before her capture. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. Tom crouched next to her, his face serious but calm. "We're almost there. The ship I've been working on is just ahead," he murmured. "It's not much, but it'll get us off this planet, and far enough away to disappear." Zara nodded, her throat dry. She didn't care what the ship looked like, as long as it could fly and get them far from the hellhole they were in. She had no intention of being auctioned off again, or worse, handed back to a new master. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. They crept forward, slipping between the shadows cast by the towering ships. Zara's senses were on high alert, her mind racing with a mixture of fear and hope. She wanted to believe in this escape, to trust that Tom's plan would work, but the galaxy had shown her too much cruelty for her to fully let her guard down. At last, they reached the ship, a small, battered freighter, tucked into a dark corner of the shipyard. Its hull was scuffed and dented from years of use, but it looked sturdy enough. Tom motioned for her to follow as he approached the access ramp. Zara hesitated, her heart thudding in her chest. This was it. If they could get aboard and lift off without being noticed, they'd be free, or at least they'd have a chance. But one mistake, one misstep, and they'd both be caught. Her gaze flicked to Tom, who was working quickly to open the ship's hatch. He glanced back at her, sensing her hesitation. "We can do this, Zara," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I've got the codes to start the engines. Once we're off the ground, we'll be gone before they even know what happened." Zara swallowed, her hands trembling slightly. She wanted to believe him, to trust in his confidence, but doubt gnawed at the edges of her mind. What if this was just another trap? What if Tom had been playing her all along, leading her into a false sense of security before handing her over to someone else? But then she saw it, the determination in his eyes, the resolve that mirrored her own. He wasn't lying. He wanted this as badly as she did. He wanted to be free. Taking a deep breath, Zara nodded and followed him up the ramp, stepping into the cramped interior of the freighter. The air inside was stale, and the walls were lined with mismatched panels and exposed wiring. It was clear the ship had seen better days, but right now, Zara couldn't care less. Tom immediately moved to the cockpit, his fingers flying over the controls with practiced ease. "I've been prepping this ship for weeks," he explained as he worked. It's an older model, so it's not tied into the main security system here. That means we won't trigger any alarms when we take off. Zara stood near the doorway, her eyes darting to the open ramp outside. The silence of the shipyard suddenly felt oppressive, like it was waiting to explode into chaos at any moment. "Hurry," she whispered, her voice tense. "They'll notice we're gone soon." Tom nodded, his face a mask of concentration as he punched in the final sequence of codes. The ship rumbled to life, the low hum of the engines vibrating through the floor beneath their feet. Zara's heart skipped a beat. They were so close. Just a few more minutes, and they'd be in the air, soaring away from this cursed planet. But then, as if on cue, the distant sound of alarms cut through the night. Zara's blood ran cold. "They've found us," Tom cursed under his breath, his fingers moving even faster over the controls. "It's okay. We're still good. We can make it." The ship began to lift off the ground, its engines roaring louder as it hovered above the landing pad. But before they could clear the docking bay, a loud thud echoed through the hull, followed by the unmistakable clang of metal against metal. Something, or someone, had latched onto the ship. Zara's heart raced as she looked through the small viewport. Outside, she could see several figures moving toward the ship, armed guards and slavers, drawn by the alarm. And worse, one of them was already scaling the side of the freighter, trying to force their way inside. "We have company," Zara shouted, her voice edged with panic. Tom's face was grim as he glanced at the sensors. "I'll try to shake them, but we need to get out of here fast." He hit a series of buttons, and the ship lurched to one side, causing the figures outside to stumble, but the one clinging to the hull held on tight. Zara's instincts kicked in. She wasn't going to let anyone take her back, not after coming this far. Without thinking, she grabbed a nearby wrench and rushed toward the access hatch. Her mind screamed at her to be cautious, to wait for Tom's plan to work, but the fire in her veins wouldn't let her stand still. As she reached the hatch, she caught sight of the intruder, a tall, muscular guard, his face twisted with anger as he pried at the ship's exterior. Without hesitation, Zara slammed the wrench against his hand with all her strength. The guard let out a grunt of pain, losing his grip and falling to the ground below as the ship lifted higher into the air. Zara stumbled back, her chest heaving, adrenaline coursing through her. She barely registered Tom's shout from the cockpit. "We're clear. Hold on." The freighter surged upward, its engines roaring as it shot into the night sky. Zara clung to the wall, her heart still racing from the confrontation. The ground fell away beneath them, the chaos of the shipyard fading into the distance. For a long moment, there was silence. Zara's mind reeled, her body still trembling from the rush of adrenaline. They had made it. They were free, or at least, they were no longer on that forsaken planet. Tom appeared in the doorway, his face pale but relieved. "You okay?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Zara nodded, though her legs felt like jelly. She glanced out the viewport, watching the planet shrink behind them as the freighter soared into the open expanse of space. The stars glittered like distant promises, vast and unreachable, yet somehow closer than they had ever felt before. "We did it," she whispered, almost in disbelief. Tom nodded, leaning against the wall, his face showing the exhaustion that had finally caught up with him. "Yeah, but this is just the beginning. They'll come after us. We need to stay low, find a place to hide until things cool down." Zara looked at him, her mind still spinning with everything that had happened. They had escaped, but the reality of what came next loomed large. They were fugitives now, both of them, and the galaxy was vast and dangerous. But despite the uncertainty ahead, for the first time in weeks, Zara felt something stir inside her that had long been buried. It was faint, but it was there. Hope. They had survived the first step of their journey, and now, for better or worse, they were in this together. As the freighter drifted into the stars, Zara allowed herself a small smile. The spark of rebellion had been ignited within her, and she wasn't going to stop until every last chain was broken. The stars, once distant and indifferent, now seemed like a path forward. One she and Tom would walk together. The freighter drifted through the quiet expanse of space, its engines humming softly as it carried Zara and Tom away from the chaos they had escaped. The blackness outside the viewport was dotted with distant stars, their cold light offering a strange sense of peace after the frantic scramble of their getaway. The silence inside the ship felt heavy, though, like the calm before an approaching storm. Zara stood in the small, cramped cockpit, staring out at the endless void. Her mind raced with conflicting thoughts. Relief at their escape, fear of being hunted, uncertainty about what came next. She had never imagined herself in this position, running from slavers, a fugitive in a galaxy that seemed determined to crush her. She had always dreamed of exploring the stars, but not like this. Tom sat in the pilot seat, his hands steady on the controls. His eyes were fixed on the navigation screen, plotting a course that would take them into uncharted territories, far from the prying eyes of those who might be looking for them. He had barely spoken since they broke atmosphere, his expression tight with concentration and fatigue. The silence between them stretched on until Zara finally broke it. "So, where are we headed?" she asked, her voice softer than she intended. Tom glanced up, his expression easing slightly. "There's a system on the edge of the galactic fringe called Saren. It's isolated, quiet. Mostly miners and traders out there. Not a lot of law enforcement, but that also means fewer eyes watching. We should be able to lay low for a while." Zara nodded, her eyes still fixed on the stars outside. "And then what?" Tom's silence lingered longer than she expected. She turned to look at him, noticing the tension in his jaw, the weight of their situation etched into the lines on his face. He was older than her by a few years, but the experiences they had endured had aged him in ways that weren't just physical. "I don't know," he admitted finally, his voice low. "Right now, we focus on surviving. After that, I guess we'll figure it out." Zara folded her arms across her chest, leaning against the cold wall of the cockpit. The uncertainty gnawed at her. She had spent so much of her life thinking about escaping Zeltron 5, about running away from her family's betrayal, but she had never thought this far ahead. What did freedom even look like? And what did it mean to be free when you were always looking over your shoulder? But despite the fear that clawed at her insides, there was something else too. Something quieter, but undeniable. She wasn't alone. Tom had been a stranger, someone who could have used her like everyone else in her life had, but he hadn't. He had risked his life for hers, and now they were in this together. For the first time since being sold into slavery, she felt a sense of solidarity that she had thought was long gone. "You didn't have to save me," she said after a long pause, her voice almost a whisper. Tom's hand stilled on the controls, and he looked up at her, his brow furrowed slightly. "I know," he replied softly, his gaze meeting hers. "But I couldn't leave you there." The sincerity in his words hit her harder than she expected. Zara had always believed that people acted out of self-interest, that no one did something for someone else without expecting something in return. Her family had proven that in the cruelest way. But here was Tom, someone who had suffered as she had, who had lost everything, and he hadn't asked for anything in return. He had simply helped. Zara felt a knot in her chest, an emotion she didn't quite recognize. She turned back toward the viewport, trying to steady her racing thoughts. "Why did you do it?" she asked quietly. "You didn't even know me." Tom exhaled slowly, leaning back in his seat. "Maybe I didn't know you, but I knew what they were going to do to you. I've seen it before. I've lived it." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "No one deserves that. I didn't want you to end up like the others." The weight of his words settled over the small cockpit, and Zara felt a lump form in her throat. She had seen it too. Other slaves broken by the system, their spirits crushed beyond repair. She had fought against it, fought to keep her hope alive, but it had been slipping away, piece by piece. Until Tom. "I guess I'm lucky then," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the hum of the ship's engines. Tom chuckled, though it was a hollow sound. "We make our own luck out here," he replied. "And right now, we've got a long way to go." For the next few hours, they flew in silence, navigating through asteroid fields and nebulae, staying off the main trade routes to avoid detection. Zara spent most of the time watching Tom work, his hands deftly adjusting the ship systems, his eyes always scanning the readings. It was clear he had been an engineer once, and though the ship was old and patched together, he knew how to keep it running. As they approached the Saren system, the tension between them seemed to ease, and for the first time since their escape, Zara felt like she could breathe. The stars outside the viewport were no longer just distant points of light. They were destinations, possibilities. "Why Saren?" Zara asked, breaking the silence again. "Why that system?" Tom glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "I used to know someone there," he said, his voice distant. "A pilot. He helped me once, a long time ago, when I was still trying to find a way out of slavery. I don't know if he's still around, but if he is, he might be able to help us get our hands on a better ship. One that can actually take us anywhere we want to go." Zara nodded, appreciating the plan, but sensing there was more to the story than Tom was sharing. She didn't push, though. They both had scars they weren't ready to reveal. As the freighter entered Saren's orbit, the planet came into view, a rocky, barren world with sprawling mining operations dotting the surface. It wasn't much to look at, but it was the kind of place where people didn't ask questions, where fugitives could disappear without drawing attention. That was exactly what they needed. Tom guided the ship toward a small landing pad on the outskirts of one of the mining towns, the engines whining as they settled onto the dusty ground. The town below looked rough, a collection of rundown buildings and scattered starships, but it was quiet. No authorities, no watchful eyes, just miners, traders, and those trying to make a living in the harshest conditions the galaxy had to offer. "We'll need supplies," Tom said as he powered down the ship. "Food, fuel, maybe some parts to patch up the freighter. And I need to find out if my contact is still around." Zara nodded, her muscles tense as she prepared to step back into the world beyond the ship. But before she could move, Tom turned to her, his expression more serious than before. "Stay close to me," he warned. "This isn't a safe place. It's easy to disappear here, but it's also easy to get into trouble. We don't know who's watching." Zara met his gaze, the warning clear in his eyes. She understood the danger. This was just another place where people like her could be sold, used, or worse. But she wasn't the same person who had been dragged in chains just days ago. She had Tom now, and though she was still learning to trust him, she knew they were in this together. As they exited the ship and stepped into the dusty streets of the mining town, Zara felt a strange mix of emotions: fear, excitement, uncertainty. But there was something else, too. She glanced at Tom, walking beside her, his eyes scanning their surroundings with practiced vigilance. She had thought she would always be alone, but now, in the vastness of space, she had found an ally, and maybe, just maybe, something more. The stars above them were still distant, still unreachable, but they were no longer just cold points of light in the sky. They were a promise of something better, something beyond the life they had known. And as Zara walked beside Tom, the spark of hope in her chest grew a little brighter. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just surviving. She was living, and it felt like the beginning of something more than just escape. It felt like the beginning of a future she had never dared to dream of, one where freedom wasn't just a distant star, but something real, something she could reach out and hold. And maybe, just maybe, Tom would be there to hold it with her. The mining town on Saren was as bleak as it had looked from the sky. Dust swirled in the hot, dry wind, coating the cracked walls of the makeshift buildings that lined the narrow streets. The air smelled of rust and fuel, a constant reminder of the heavy machinery that worked the planet's rich mines day and night. Zara and Tom moved cautiously through the marketplace, where traders bartered for parts, tools, and whatever meager supplies were available. Despite the grime and the weariness etched into the faces of the miners and traders, Zara could feel a pulse of life in the town. People surviving, scraping by, carving out an existence in the far reaches of the galaxy. It wasn't glamorous, but there was a strange resilience here, a quiet determination that mirrored the fire inside her. Tom had said little since they landed. His focus on finding his contact, the pilot who might be able to help them. He walked with purpose, keeping his head down and his movements deliberate, as if trying to blend into the shadows of the town. Zara followed closely behind, her eyes scanning the marketplace for any sign of danger. She still didn't fully trust this world, nor the people in it, but she was learning to trust Tom. As they passed a group of rough-looking traders, Tom suddenly stopped in his tracks. His eyes locked on a figure standing at a small stall near the end of the street. A grizzled man in a worn leather jacket, his skin tanned and scarred from years of living in harsh environments. He had an air of quiet confidence, the kind that comes from surviving countless battles, and a weathered face that told stories of a life spent on the edge of the galaxy. "That's him," Tom whispered to Zara, his voice low. "Kale Drayan, the pilot I told you about." Zara eyed the man carefully, unsure of what to expect. Kale didn't look like someone who had a lot of friends, but she supposed that was part of the reason he had survived for so long. People like him didn't make it out here by trusting easily. Tom approached cautiously, and Zara followed at his side. As they neared the stall, Kale looked up, his sharp eyes narrowing as they landed on Tom. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke, as if weighing each other's presence, calculating the risks. Then Kale's lips curled into a thin smile. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, his voice rough from years of breathing in harsh atmospheres. "Tom Carter, I thought you were dead." Tom smiled faintly, though his expression was tight with tension. "Not yet." Kale gave a short laugh and leaned back against his stall, crossing his arms over his chest. "What brings you to this charming corner of the galaxy? Last I heard, you were neck-deep in a mess with some slavers on the other side of the rim." Tom's face darkened at the mention of slavers. "It's a long story. I need your help, Kale." The pilot raised an eyebrow. "Help, huh? You're lucky I still owe you one. What kind of trouble are you in this time?" Tom glanced at Zara, his expression softening for just a moment before turning back to Kale. "We're trying to stay off the radar. We need a ship. Something fast, something that can get us out of here without attracting attention." Kale's gaze flickered to Zara, sizing her up in an instant. "Who's the girl?" Zara tensed, not liking the way he was scrutinizing her, but Tom placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "She's with me. That's all you need to know." Kale held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "Fair enough." He turned his attention back to Tom, his eyes narrowing. "You do realize that getting out of here without attracting attention is a bit of a tall order, right? Especially with the kind of heat you're probably carrying." Tom's jaw tightened. "I wouldn't be asking if I had other options." For a moment, Kale seemed to consider the situation, his gaze flicking between Tom and Zara. Then he let out a heavy sigh and ran a hand through his graying hair. "All right, I know a guy. He's got a ship, a light freighter, fast, maneuverable, and off the books. I can make the introductions, but it's going to cost you." Zara felt a knot tighten in her stomach. They barely had enough credits to buy fuel, let alone bribe a pilot. She glanced at Tom, wondering what he would say. Tom didn't hesitate. "We'll figure it out." Kale raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical but not pressing further. "All right then, I'll set up a meeting, but you owe me, Tom. And this time, I'm not letting you disappear without paying me back." Tom nodded, his face grim. "I know." Kale gave them a curt nod and turned back to his stall, leaving Tom and Zara standing in the dusty street. Zara couldn't help but feel a wave of unease. This was just another in a long line of risks, and they were in no position to make enemies. Still, they didn't have much of a choice. As they walked away from Kale's stall, Zara turned to Tom. "Do we have enough to pay him?" Tom sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Barely, but we'll make it work. We have to." Zara bit her lip, the weight of their situation pressing down on her. "And if we don't," Tom looked at her, his eyes steady despite the uncertainty swirling around them. Then we keep moving. We survive, just like we always have. There was a quiet strength in his voice, a resilience that Zara admired. Despite everything they had been through, Tom hadn't given up, and that gave her hope. They were running, yes, but they weren't running aimlessly. They had a goal, to be free, to build a future beyond the chains that had once bound them. And now, that future felt closer than ever. The next few hours passed in tense anticipation as they waited for Cale to arrange the meeting. Tom busied himself with inspecting the freighter they had arrived in, trying to salvage any spare parts that might help them in the journey ahead. Zara wandered through the marketplace, keeping her hood low and her movements cautious, but she couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were on her. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the dusty streets, Tom returned from the freighter with a determined look on his face. Cale just sent word. The meeting's set for tonight. Zara nodded, steeling herself for what lay ahead. The danger wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. But as she stood beside Tom, ready to face whatever came next, she felt a strange sense of calm. She wasn't alone in this fight. Not anymore. They made their way to a secluded part of the town, where Cale had arranged a meeting with the pilot. The place was dimly lit, tucked away from the main thoroughfare, and the shadows seemed to cling to the walls like they had secrets to hide. As they approached, a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out from the darkness, his face partially obscured by a hood. He looked them over, his expression unreadable. "You're the ones looking for a ship?" he asked, his voice low and rough. Tom nodded. "We need something fast and discreet." The man studied them for a moment before nodding toward a nearby hangar. "Follow me." They entered the hangar, where a sleek, battered freighter sat waiting. It was smaller than Zara had expected, but it had a certain charm. Like it had survived 1,000 battles and was ready for 1,000 more. The pilot ran a hand along the ship's hull, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "She's not much to look at," he said, "but she'll get you where you need to go. No one's going to track this ship unless you make a scene." Tom glanced at Zara, and she could see the faint flicker of hope in his eyes. This was their chance. A real shot at freedom. "How much?" Tom asked, his voice cautious. The pilot gave him a calculating look before naming a price that made Zara's heart sink. It was more than they had, far more. Tom's expression tightened, and for a moment, Zara thought the deal was dead in the water. But then the pilot spoke again, his tone shifting. "Or you could do something for me." Tom stiffened. "What kind of something?" The pilot's eyes gleamed in the dim light. "I've got a job, a delivery, simple enough. You help me with that, and I'll cut the price in half." Zara exchanged a look with Tom, knowing this was just another risk in a long string of risks. But what choice did they have? Tom nodded slowly. "We'll do it." The pilot smiled a sharp, calculating grin. "Good. Then it's a deal." As the night deepened and the stars blinked into view overhead, Zara felt the weight of their decision settle over her. The road ahead was uncertain, and the stakes were higher than ever. But she wasn't afraid, because for the first time in her life, she wasn't running from something. She was running toward something, toward freedom, toward a future where she could finally live on her own terms. And as she glanced at Tom, she realized that she wasn't running alone. The dawn of a new life was just beginning, and no matter how dark. The freighter hummed as it powered through the vastness of space, the stars streaking past like silent witnesses to Zara and Tom's journey. Despite the seemingly endless stretch of stars, the tension in the cockpit was palpable. They had made a deal with the pilot to earn their freedom, but the weight of what they had agreed to hung over them like a storm cloud. The delivery they had agreed to carry out felt too easy, too simple for the dangerous world they were navigating. Zara sat in the co-pilot seat, her eyes fixed on the navigation screen, her mind replaying the events of the last few hours. The pilot, a grizzled man named Kalen, had been cryptic about the cargo. He hadn't revealed much, only that it was valuable and needed to reach its destination without any attention. For someone like Kalen, that was saying something. "We're entering the grid of Centurious 4, Tom said, his voice breaking through the silence. He was focused, his hands steady on the controls, but Zara could see the tension in his jaw. He didn't like this any more than she did. Zara nodded, her fingers drumming nervously on the armrest. Centurious 4 was a known smuggler's haven, a lawless planet in a system where almost anything could be bought or sold, no questions asked. It was a perfect place for someone like Kalen to conduct business, but also a breeding ground for trouble. They needed to keep their heads down, make the delivery, and leave before anyone took too much interest in them. "Do you think this is going to be as simple as he said?" Zara asked, her voice low. Tom didn't look at her, but she could see the doubt flicker in his eyes. "No, it never is." Zara sighed, leaning back in her seat. They had come so far, risked so much, and now it felt like they were right back where they started, caught in the middle of something dangerous, with no clear way out. Still, she had learned to trust Tom's instincts, and he hadn't let her down yet. He had gotten them this far. She had to believe he could get them through this too. As the freighter descended toward the planet's surface, the landscape came into view, a sprawling metropolis of towering buildings and sprawling factories, lit by the eerie glow of neon signs and industrial flames. The planet's atmosphere was thick with smog, casting everything in a perpetual haze of gray. Zara felt a knot form in her stomach as they flew closer to the landing site Kalen had given them. "We'll land in the southern district," Tom said, his eyes scanning the readouts on the control panel. "It's more industrial, less likely to be patrolled by anyone who cares about what's being moved in or out." Zara nodded, though the knot in her stomach only tightened. She didn't like the feeling of being on a planet where lawlessness ruled, but they had no choice. Kalen had made it clear that this job was their only way to secure the ship and, with it, their freedom. The freighter touched down on the outskirts of a massive warehouse complex. The area was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rumble of distant machinery. Tom powered down the engines, and for a moment they both sat in silence, neither willing to make the first move. Zara's mind raced with questions. What was in the cargo hold? Why had Kalen been so vague about the details? And more importantly, who were they delivering it to? "I'll check the cargo," Zara said, breaking the silence. She pushed herself out of the co-pilot's seat and made her way toward the ship's hold. As she entered the dimly lit cargo bay, Zara's heart pounded. The crate they were supposed to deliver sat in the center of the room, its metallic surface gleaming under the dim lights. It was locked with a high-level encryption seal, one that Zara knew she couldn't crack. Whatever was inside, it was valuable, perhaps more valuable than Kalen had let on. She ran her fingers over the surface of the crate, her mind racing with possibilities. Weapons, drugs, something worse? The longer she stared at it, the more uneasy she felt. There was something wrong about this, something off. Tom's voice crackled through the comm system. "You okay back there?" Zara pressed the comm button. "Yeah, but this cargo, I don't like it, Tom. We don't even know what we're delivering." "I don't like it either," Tom admitted, his voice tense. "But we don't have much of a choice. We need that ship." Zara sighed, knowing he was right. They were in too deep now. They couldn't back out without losing everything they had fought for. She made her way back to the cockpit, her thoughts still lingering on the mysterious crate. As she sat down beside Tom, the ship's comm system crackled to life. A distorted voice echoed through the cockpit. "You're late." Zara's heart skipped a beat, and Tom's eyes narrowed. He pressed the comm button, keeping his voice steady. "We're here now. Where do you want the delivery?" The voice on the other end was low, cold, and distinctly dangerous. "Bring it to the warehouse on Grid 18. And don't make me wait any longer." The transmission cut off, leaving the cockpit in tense silence. "Great," Zara muttered. "Friendly." Tom set the coordinates for Grid 18 and activated the thrusters, lifting the freighter off the ground. As they approached the grid, Zara could see the warehouse looming in the distance, a massive structure surrounded by shipping containers and heavy machinery. It looked like every other warehouse on the planet, but something about it felt wrong. They landed near the entrance, the freighter's engines powering down with a low hum. Zara's pulse quickened as they prepared to exit the ship. This was the moment of truth. If something went wrong, if this delivery turned out to be more dangerous than they had anticipated, they'd have to make a run for it. And in a place like Centurious 4, running usually meant dying. "Stay close," Tom said, his voice low but steady. "Let me do the talking." Zara nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She followed him down the ramp and into the heavy, smog-filled air of Centurious 4. The warehouse entrance was guarded by 2 men, both of them heavily armed and wearing the unmistakable look of mercenaries. Hard eyes, scarred faces, and weapons ready at their sides. One of the guards stepped forward, his hand resting on his blaster. "You the ones with the cargo?" Tom nodded. "Yeah, it's in the ship." The guard eyed them both suspiciously before gesturing toward the warehouse. "Bring it inside. Boss wants to see it." Zara exchanged a glance with Tom. They both knew this wasn't standard procedure. The plan had been to deliver the crate and leave, not meet whoever was in charge. But they had no choice now. They were in too deep. They retrieved the crate from the freighter, the weight of it heavier than Zara had expected. The 2 of them carried it toward the warehouse, the guards watching them closely as they entered the dark, cavernous building. Inside, the atmosphere was even more unsettling. The space was dimly lit, filled with stacks of crates and heavy machinery, and the air was thick with the scent of oil and chemicals. At the far end of the room, a figure stood waiting, a tall man with sharp features and cold eyes, dressed in sleek, dark clothing. He exuded an aura of power and control, the kind of man who was used to getting what he wanted. "Put it down," the man said, his voice smooth but commanding. Zara and Tom set the crate down on the floor, stepping back as the man approached. He circled the crate slowly, his eyes flicking toward Zara for just a moment before focusing back on the cargo. "You've done well," he said, though there was no warmth in his voice. "This will make me a very wealthy man." Zara's unease deepened. She didn't like this man, didn't like the way he moved, the way he spoke. There was something predatory about him, something dangerous. The man turned to face them, his eyes gleaming with cold amusement. "I'm afraid your part in this is over." Zara's blood ran cold. She knew what was coming before it even happened. "Tom, we need to." But before she could finish, the guards moved. One grabbed Tom, pinning him to the floor, while the other reached for Zara. She reacted instinctively, twisting out of the way and slamming her elbow into the guard's ribs. He grunted in pain, but recovered quickly, drawing a blaster from his side. "Zara," Tom shouted, struggling against the guard holding him down. Zara's mind raced, adrenaline pumping through her veins. She had fought before, but never like this, never against men who were trained killers. She needed to think, needed to act before it was too late. And then, as if the stars themselves had aligned in her favor, she spotted something, an exposed power conduit running along the wall. Without hesitating, she kicked it with all her strength, sending a shower of sparks into the air. The guard flinched, momentarily blinded, and Zara seized the opportunity. She grabbed the blaster from his hand and turned it on the other guard, firing before he could react. The shot hit him square in the chest, and he crumpled to the floor. Tom broke free of the other guard's grip, grabbing a wrench from the nearby crate and swinging it with brutal force. The guard went down unconscious. The man who had been overseeing the deal watched them with cold amusement, as if this was nothing more than entertainment to him. But when Zara turned the blaster on him, his smile faltered. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice dripping with malice. Zara stepped forward, her heart pounding. "No, you are." With one swift motion, she fired. The shot hit the man in the shoulder, and he staggered back, clutching the wound. Zara and Tom didn't wait to see what happened next. They grabbed the crate and bolted for the exit, the sound of shouting and alarms echoing behind them. As they ran toward the freighter, Zara's heart raced with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. They had survived. They had fought back. And now they had to escape. The freighter's engines roared to life as they sprinted up the ramp, the cargo still in their possession. Tom slammed his hands on the controls, and the ship lifted off the ground just as blaster fire peppered the hull. They shot into the sky, leaving Centuria's 4 behind. In the cockpit, Zara collapsed into the co-pilot seat, her chest heaving with adrenaline. Tom glanced at her, his face pale but relieved. "You okay?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Zara nodded, though her heart was still pounding. "Yeah, I think so." They flew in silence for a long moment, the stars streaking past them once again. Zara's mind raced, replaying the events of the last few minutes, the intensity of the fight, the danger they had narrowly escaped. But beneath the fear, there was something else, something fierce and determined. They had survived. They had fought back. And now, as they soared through the stars, Zara knew one thing for certain. She was no longer the girl who had been sold into slavery, no longer the girl who had been helpless and afraid. She was something more now, stronger, braver, and with Tom by her side, there was nothing they couldn't face. The shadows of the past still loomed over them, but together they would carve out a future free from the chains that had once bound them. A new dawn was rising, and Zara was ready for whatever came next. The freighter soared through the stars, carrying Zara and Tom far from Centuria's 4 and the chaos they had just narrowly escaped. The adrenaline still thrummed through Zara's veins, her body tense from the fight. She couldn't shake the feeling that the danger wasn't over. They had stolen more than just their freedom. Whatever was in that crate was valuable enough to make dangerous enemies, and those enemies would be coming for them. Zara sat in the cockpit, her eyes scanning the vast emptiness of space, trying to calm the storm raging inside her. The stars, once symbols of hope and freedom, now seemed distant, cold, and unforgiving. She felt like a fugitive, constantly looking over her shoulder, waiting for the next threat to emerge from the shadows. Tom sat beside her, silent but focused, his hands gripping the controls, as if holding them too tightly might keep everything from unraveling. His expression was hard, his jaw clenched as he concentrated on navigating their escape route. The moment they had fought their way off Centuria's 4, something had shifted between them. They had crossed a line, and there was no going back. "We need to figure out what's in that crate," Zara said, breaking the silence, her voice sharp with tension. "We can't keep running blind." Tom glanced at her, his brow furrowing. "I've been thinking the same thing. Whatever it is, it's worth a lot more than Kalen told us." Zara stood, her muscles still aching from the fight, and made her way to the cargo hold. The crate sat in the center of the room, its metallic surface gleaming under the low lights of the ship. Zara stared at it, the weight of its secrets pressing down on her. What was inside? What was worth risking their lives for? Tom followed her, his face set with determination. "We need to open it," he said quietly. "We can't keep running if we don't know what we're carrying." Zara nodded, her heart pounding. They had been avoiding this moment, but there was no more time for hesitation. She grabbed a nearby plasma cutter and knelt by the crate, carefully slicing through the encryption seal. The sparks flew as the seal cracked open with a hiss of escaping air. When the crate finally clicked open, Zara held her breath and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled within layers of protective foam, was a small, sleek device, no larger than a data pad. It looked unassuming at first glance, but the faint blue glow emanating from its surface told Zara this was no ordinary piece of tech. "What is it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Tom knelt beside her, his eyes wide as he examined the device. "It's a neural interface," he said slowly, his voice filled with disbelief. "But this is advanced, way beyond anything we've seen before." Zara's pulse quickened. "What does it do?" Tom ran his fingers over the surface of the device, frowning in concentration. Neural interfaces are used to connect a person's mind directly to a computer system or network. But this could be different. It might be able to access more than just basic systems. It could tap into galactic networks, databases, maybe even military grids. Zara's mind raced, the implications of Tom's words sinking in. So this is why Kalen wanted it so badly, and why those people were willing to kill for it. Tom nodded grimly. This thing could be worth a fortune on the black market. Whoever controls it could have access to some of the most powerful systems in the galaxy. It's no wonder they're coming after us. Zara felt a wave of nausea wash over her. They weren't just carrying stolen goods. They were carrying something that could tip the balance of power in the galaxy. And now, they were at the center of it all. We can't let it fall into the wrong hands, she said, her voice firm. We need to get rid of it. Tom looked at her, his eyes shadowed with worry. I agree, but getting rid of it won't be easy. Whoever is after this won't just let us walk away. Zara clenched her fists, determination hardening inside her. Then we don't walk away. We fight. Tom raised an eyebrow, surprised by the intensity in her voice. Fight? Zara, these people, whoever they are, they're not just criminals. They have resources, power. We're two people with a stolen freighter. How are we supposed to fight them? Zara turned to face him, her eyes blazing with resolve. Because we don't have a choice. Running won't save us. They'll keep coming no matter where we go. If we want to survive, we need to take control of the situation. We need to make a stand. Tom studied her for a moment, and then he nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. You're right. We've been reacting this whole time, letting them control the game. It's time we flipped the script. Zara felt a surge of adrenaline as the plan began to form in her mind. They couldn't keep hiding, couldn't keep running. They had to confront their enemies head-on, and they had to do it smart. They would need allies, resources, and a place to make their stand. We need to find someone who can help us, Zara said, pacing the length of the cargo hold. Someone who knows how to fight back against people like this. There has to be a resistance group or an outlaw network. Someone who doesn't want this tech falling into the wrong hands. Tom nodded thoughtfully. I know a place. There's a neutral space station not far from here, Haven Station. It's a hub for smugglers, mercenaries, and anyone who doesn't want to be found. If there's anyone out there willing to fight against a group like this, we'll find them there. Zara felt a spark of hope flare inside her. Haven Station. It wasn't much, but it was a start. It was a place where they could regroup, find allies, and maybe, just maybe, turn the tide in their favor. Set a course for Haven Station, she said, her voice steady with determination. We're not running anymore. As the freighter cut through space toward Haven Station, Zara couldn't shake the feeling that their lives had been irrevocably changed. She glanced at Tom, who was focused on the navigation console, his face set in determination. They had come a long way from the frightened fugitives they had been just days ago. Now, they were on the cusp of something bigger, something that could change the course of the galaxy. But with that power came danger, and Zara knew that the people hunting them would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. After several hours, the freighter approached Haven Station, a massive, sprawling structure nestled in a nebula. The station was a marvel of patchwork engineering, cobbled together from decades of wreckage, abandoned ships, and salvaged tech. It hung in the depths of space like a beacon for the lost and the lawless. As they approached, Zara felt a sense of awe. She had heard stories about Haven Station, stories of smugglers, freedom fighters, and those who operated in the gray areas of the galaxy. It was a place where no one asked questions, where deals were made in the shadows, and where alliances could be forged or broken in a heartbeat. Tom guided the freighter into one of the docking bays, and as they landed, Zara could feel the tension in the air. They were stepping into the heart of a world they barely understood, a world that operated by its own rules. But if they were going to fight back, this was where it had to begin. As they disembarked, Zara took in her surroundings. The docking bay was alive with activity, mechanics working on ships, traders haggling over goods, and mercenaries exchanging quiet, dangerous glances. It was a place where trust was hard to come by, but that made it all the more valuable. We need to find someone who knows what's going on, Tom said, scanning the crowds. Someone who can help us figure out who's after the tech and how we can stop them. Zara nodded, her gaze sharp as she surveyed the people around them. They couldn't afford to make a mistake here. The wrong move, the wrong ally, and everything could fall apart. They moved through the bustling corridors of the station, passing shady merchants and hardened mercenaries, until they reached the central hub, a large, dimly lit bar known as the Black Hole. It was the kind of place where deals were made in whispers and secrets exchanged over drinks. If there was anyone on Haven Station who could help them, they would be here. As they entered, Zara felt the eyes of the patrons on them, sizing them up, measuring their worth. She stayed close to Tom, her hand resting near the blaster at her side. They didn't belong here, at least not yet. Tom led them to a corner table, away from the prying eyes of the crowd. "We need to be careful," he whispered. "We can't trust anyone until we know who's pulling the strings." Zara nodded, her pulse quickening. This was the turning point. Everything they had been through had led them here, to this moment, where they would make their stand. Suddenly, a figure approached their table, a tall, imposing woman with short-cropped hair and a no-nonsense expression. She wore a long coat, the kind favored by smugglers and bounty hunters, and there was a scar that ran across her left cheek. Her eyes were sharp, taking in every detail of Zara and Tom with practiced ease. "You're new here," the woman said, her voice low but commanding. "And you look like you're in trouble." Zara tensed, ready to defend herself, but Tom raised a hand, signaling for her to stay calm. "We might be," he said carefully. "Depends on who's asking." The woman smirked, leaning against their table. "Name's Valeria. I hear things. And I've heard a whisper or two about a couple of fugitives carrying something valuable." Zara's heart skipped a beat, and she could feel Tom stiffen beside her. How had word gotten out so quickly? Had someone already tipped off the wrong people? Valeria's gaze flickered to the side, and she leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "If you're smart, you'll want to stick close to me. I know how to deal with the kind of people who are coming after you." Zara hesitated, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. Could they trust Valeria? Or was this another trap? But one thing was clear, they couldn't do this alone. Zara exchanged a glance with Tom, and after a long moment, he gave a slight nod. They didn't have a choice. They needed allies, and Valeria seemed like their best bet for now. "All right," Zara said, her voice steady. "We're listening." Valeria smiled, a glint of something dangerous in her eyes. "Good, because if you want to survive what's coming next, you're going to need me." As the three of them sat together in the shadows of the Black Hole, Zara felt the weight of the future pressing down on her. This was it, the beginning of their final stand. They had made enemies, powerful ones, but now they had a plan. And for the first time in a long time, Zara didn't feel like they were running. They were ready to fight. And together, they would face whatever came next. The stars beyond the station gleamed like a promise, one that Zara and Tom were determined to fulfill. The dim lighting inside the Black Hole cast long shadows across the bar, where Zara, Tom, and their new ally, Valeria, sat huddled together, the weight of the coming battle heavy in the air. Zara could feel the tension in the room, the constant hum of danger that seemed to follow them everywhere now. Valeria, the hardened smuggler with sharp eyes and even sharper instincts, had agreed to help them. But Zara knew there was more to her than she was letting on. Trust was a rare commodity in places like Haven Station. "First things first," Valeria said, leaning back in her chair, her voice low but commanding. "You need to understand that whoever's after you, and that tech, won't stop. These people aren't just your run-of-the-mill thugs. They're connected, powerful, and they'll come at you with everything they have. You need more than just me if you want to survive." Zara exchanged a glance with Tom. They had known this was bigger than just them for a while now, but hearing it laid out so plainly sent a chill through her. They were up against forces that could crush them without a second thought. "What do you suggest?" Tom asked, his voice calm but filled with the same urgency Zara felt. Valeria leaned forward, her eyes scanning the room as if making sure no one was listening. We need an army. And lucky for you, Haven Station's got more than a few people who might be interested in sticking it to the kind of people who hunt fugitives like you. An army? Zara asked, her brow furrowing. We can barely trust anyone. How are we supposed to recruit mercenaries and smugglers to fight on our side? Valeria smiled faintly, her expression full of calculated confidence. You'd be surprised what people will fight for if the stakes are high enough. And in this galaxy, everyone's got a score to settle. All we have to do is give them the right incentive. Zara and Tom exchanged another glance. The enormity of what Valeria was suggesting settling over them. They weren't just trying to escape anymore. They were preparing for war. So, what's the plan? Tom asked, his tone resolute. Valeria straightened. All business now. We gather the right people. Fighters, smugglers, hackers. Anyone with a grudge against the syndicates or the corrupt powers that be. We make them an offer. Help us take down whoever's coming after you, and they'll get a cut of whatever we find along the way. Freedom, credits, revenge, whatever motivates them. Zara leaned forward, her pulse quickening. And you think you can convince them? Valeria smirked. I've been around this station long enough to know who's looking for an opportunity to strike back. It won't be easy, but I've got the connections. And once we have the right people, we'll set the trap. The trap? Tom raised an eyebrow. Valeria's eyes gleamed. The people coming after you, they're expecting you to keep running, keep hiding. They're used to being the hunters. What they won't expect is for you to stand and fight. We let them come to us, right here on Haven Station. But this time, we'll be ready. Zara's breath caught in her throat. The idea of setting a trap for the people who had been hunting them was both terrifying and exhilarating. It meant taking the fight to their enemies, putting an end to the constant running. But it also meant risking everything. She glanced at Tom, who nodded slowly, his expression hardening with determination. We're in. Valeria's smile widened. Good, because this is the only way you're going to get out of this alive. The next few days were a blur of preparation. Valeria worked tirelessly, calling in old favors, meeting with dangerous figures in the shadows of Haven Station. Zara and Tom followed her lead, but the more they got involved, the more Zara realized just how deep Valeria's connections ran. She wasn't just a smuggler. She was a power player in the underworld. Someone who knew how to navigate the tangled web of alliances and rivalries that thrived in places like Haven. Zara and Tom spent their days checking the ship, gathering weapons, and preparing the freighter for what would inevitably be a quick getaway if things went wrong. But it wasn't just about the freighter anymore. The fight was closing in on them, and they had no choice but to face it head-on. Late one night, after hours of planning and strategizing, Zara found herself standing on the observation deck of the station, staring out at the stars. The galaxy had always seemed so vast, so filled with possibility, but now it felt smaller. The weight of their situation pressed down on her, and she wondered if they could really pull this off. Could they outwit and outfight the syndicates, mercenaries, and power brokers that were surely coming for them? Tom appeared beside her, his presence a quiet comfort in the chaos. He stood with his hands in his pockets, gazing out at the same stars she was. Do you think we can do this? Zara asked quietly, her voice barely audible over the hum of the station systems. Tom was silent for a moment, his eyes reflecting the distant lights of the nebula beyond. I think we have to, he said finally. We've come this far, Zara. We've fought through worse. If we don't make a stand now, we'll never be free. Zara turned to look at him, her heart aching with the truth of his words. Tom had been her constant through everything, through betrayal, captivity, and escape. She didn't know if she could do this without him. I'm scared, she admitted, the vulnerability in her voice surprising even herself. Tom looked at her, his expression softening. He stepped closer, gently brushing a strand of her hair away from her face. So am I, he said quietly. But we've survived this long because we've stuck together. And we'll get through this too, no matter what happens. Zara felt a lump form in her throat, the weight of their shared journey hanging between them. She had never let herself depend on anyone, not since her family had betrayed her, but with Tom, it was different. He had been there when no one else had, and despite everything, they had found something deeper than just survival. She reached out and took his hand, squeezing it tightly. "Whatever happens, we fight together." Tom smiled, his eyes filled with warmth despite the tension in the air. Together. The day of the final stand arrived faster than Zara had anticipated. The air inside Haven Station was electric with tension, and the undercurrents of danger seemed to ripple through the corridors. Valeria had done her part. She had gathered an eclectic group of allies, from grizzled mercenaries to sly hackers, each with their own reasons for wanting to take down the powerful forces hunting Zara and Tom. The trap was set. Zara, Tom, and Valeria stood in a command room, staring at the holographic display that outlined the plan. The Syndicate's ships were closing in, and it wouldn't be long before they landed on the station, expecting to capture Zara and take the neural interface device. "Everyone's in position," Valeria said, her voice calm but sharp. "When they land, we'll let them think they've cornered you. But the moment they make their move, we strike." Zara's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing through every possible scenario. She had always been a fighter, but this was different. This wasn't just about her survival anymore. This was about taking down the people who had hunted her, about ensuring that no one else would ever be used or sold again. Tom stood beside her, his expression hard, focused. She could see the determination in his eyes, the same fire that had carried them through every trial they had faced together. He was ready. So was she. As the moments ticked by, the tension mounted. The holographic display flashed with new data. Ships had landed on the station, heavily armed forces disembarking and making their way through the lower corridors. They were coming. "They're here," Valeria said, her voice low but steady. Zara took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Let's do this." The battle erupted like a storm. The Syndicate forces, heavily armed and well-trained, moved through the station's corridors with brutal efficiency. But Valeria's forces were ready. Ambushes were set, traps laid, and the station's layout itself became a weapon in their hands. Gunfire echoed through the halls as the two sides clashed, the sounds of explosions and blaster fire reverberating through the metal walls. Zara fought alongside Tom, her blaster firing with precision as they made their way through the chaos. The station was a war zone, but they had the advantage. They knew the terrain, and they had allies at every turn. As they moved toward the Syndicate's command unit, Zara could feel the tide of battle shifting in their favor. Valeria had planned the ambush well, and the Syndicate forces were being pushed back, their overconfidence proving to be their downfall. But then, in the heat of battle, something shifted. A figure emerged from the smoke and chaos, a man dressed in sleek, dark armor, his face hidden behind a mask. His movements were swift, calculated, and deadly, cutting through Valeria's forces with ease. Zara's blood ran cold. She recognized him immediately. It was a man from Centurious 4, the Syndicate's leader, the one who had overseen the deal for the neural interface. He was here, and he was coming for her. "We need to move," Tom shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward cover as the masked man advanced. Zara's heart pounded as she and Tom ducked behind a stack of crates, their blasters at the ready. The man's presence was overwhelming, his power palpable. This wasn't just a hired gun. He was a force of nature, and he wouldn't stop until he had what he came for. "I'll draw his attention," Tom said, his voice urgent. "You go for the command center. If we take it, we can cut off their reinforcements." "No," Zara protested, her eyes wide. "I'm not leaving you to face him alone." Tom looked at her, his expression fierce but tender. "You have to, Zara. This is our only chance. We end this here, together." Zara's chest tightened, fear and adrenaline warring inside her. But she knew he was right. If they didn't stop the Syndicate's leader now, everything they had fought for would be lost. "I'll come back for you," she promised, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. Tom nodded, his eyes locked on hers. "I know." With one last look, Zara turned and sprinted toward the command center, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear the sounds of battle behind her, the clash of weapons and the shouts of fighters, but she forced herself to focus. This was the moment everything had led to. The command center loomed ahead, heavily guarded but vulnerable. Zara fired her blaster, taking down the guards with quick, precise shots. She pushed through the doors, her breath ragged as she reached the central console. Her fingers flew across the controls, inputting the codes Valeria had given her. The neural interface was powerful, but Zara had learned how to wield it in the past few days. She connected it to the station's mainframe, overriding the system. Outside, the Syndicate's forces began to falter as Zara cut off their reinforcements. The tide of battle was turning in their favor, but there was one fight left. Zara turned back toward the battlefield, her heart hammering in her chest. She had promised to come back for Tom, and she would keep that promise. She sprinted through the corridors, her blaster at the ready, her mind racing. When she reached the central docking bay, her breath caught in her throat. Tom was on the ground, struggling against the masked man, who stood over him with a blade in hand, ready to deliver the final blow. "No!" Zara screamed, raising her blaster and firing. The shot hit the masked man in the shoulder, knocking him back. Tom scrambled to his feet, grabbing his blaster and firing as well. The masked man staggered, but he didn't fall. He turned toward Zara, his gaze cold and calculating, even through the mask. For a moment, the air between them seemed to freeze, and Zara felt a surge of fear. But then, from behind the masked man, Valeria appeared, silent, deadly. She drove a blade into the man's side, twisting it with brutal precision. The man let out a guttural sound, his body going rigid before he finally collapsed to the ground. Zara stood there, her breath ragged, her heart pounding in her chest. It was over. She ran to Tom, who was battered but alive. He smiled at her, his expression filled with relief and exhaustion. "I knew you'd come back for me." Zara knelt beside him, her chest tight with emotion. "I told you I would." Valeria wiped the blood from her blade, her expression unreadable. "We did it. They're done." Zara nodded, the weight of their victory settling over her like a wave. They had won. The Syndicate had been defeated, their leader gone, and the neural interface was safe from those who would use it for harm. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Zara felt the tension in her body begin to ease. The battle was over. They were free. She turned to Tom, who was still sitting on the ground, catching his breath. "What now?" she asked, her voice quiet. Tom looked at her, his eyes filled with warmth and hope. "Now we live. Together." Zara smiled, a small, genuine smile that she hadn't allowed herself in so long. The stars above Haven Station gleamed through the docking bay's windows, bright and endless. They had fought for their freedom, and now it was theirs. Together. As the sounds of the station quieted and the smoke from the battle cleared, Zara knew one thing for certain. They had survived the shadows of the past, and now they could finally look toward the future. A new dawn had come, and this time it was theirs to shape. Together, they would face whatever came next. The quiet hum of Haven Station echoed through the dimly lit docking bay as Zara sat beside Tom, her back against the cold metal wall of their freighter. The battle was over, but the echoes of it still pulsed in her mind. Flashes of blaster fire, the sharp clang of metal against metal, the chilling sight of the Syndicate's leader lying defeated on the floor. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the adrenaline had finally worn off, leaving behind a strange emptiness. Zara's body ached, her muscles protesting every movement, but the pain felt distant, almost like it belonged to someone else. She glanced over at Tom, who was slumped beside her, his face bruised but alive. They had survived. They had won. "You okay?" Tom asked, his voice hoarse but filled with warmth. Zara gave him a small, tired smile. "Yeah, just trying to believe it's over." Tom leaned his head back against the wall, closing his eyes for a moment. "Me too." The aftermath of the battle had been swift. The Syndicate's forces had crumbled once their leader fell, and Valeria's plan had worked like a charm. Zara and Tom had finally stopped running, but now that the fight was over, the enormity of what they had accomplished began to sink in. They had toppled a powerful enemy, one that had hunted them across the galaxy, and now they were free. But what did freedom mean after everything they had been through? Zara's mind wandered as she stared out at the stars beyond the station's windows. They glittered like cold, distant gems, unchanging despite everything that had happened. She had dreamed of those stars for so long, of a life where she wasn't bound by chains or fear, where she could choose her own path. And now, the future stretched out before her like those stars, vast and full of possibilities. "I don't know what to do now," she admitted softly, the weight of her words heavy in the stillness of the docking bay. "I've spent so long running, fighting. I don't know what comes next." Tom opened his eyes and turned his head to look at her, his expression soft. "You're not alone, Zara. We'll figure it out. Together." Zara felt a warmth bloom in her chest at his words, a comfort she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. She had been alone for so long, even when she had been with her family, alone in her dreams, in her hope for something better. But with Tom, things had changed. They had fought together, survived together, and now they were looking at a future that didn't seem so terrifying. Not with him by her side. "Together," Zara repeated, the word like a promise between them. She shifted, leaning her head against Tom's shoulder, her body finally relaxing after days of tension. Tom didn't say anything, but he reached for her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. For a long moment, they sat there in silence, watching the stars beyond the station's glass windows. The battle was behind them, and for the first time in a long while, Zara allowed herself to believe that they could rest. The next day, the mood in Haven Station had shifted. Where there had once been an air of tension and weariness, there was now a sense of quiet relief. The fight was over, and the station had emerged relatively unscathed, despite the heavy firefight that had raged through its corridors. People moved about their business, as if trying to forget the violence that had swept through the station the night before. Zara and Tom stood in the main marketplace, waiting for Valeria. The smuggler had disappeared after the battle, handling the last loose ends with the various mercenaries and outlaws who had fought by their side. Zara wasn't sure what to expect from Valeria next. The woman had a way of vanishing when it suited her, but they owed her a debt they weren't sure how to repay. As they waited, Zara found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. She thought about her family, the betrayal that had shattered her world, and the dark days of captivity that had followed. She thought about how much she had changed since then, how much she had learned to trust herself. And Tom. She had gone from a girl sold into slavery to someone who had taken down a syndicate. The thought filled her with a strange mixture of pride and disbelief. "You thinking about what comes next?" Tom asked, pulling her from her thoughts. Zara nodded, her eyes scanning the bustling marketplace. "Yeah, I just don't know what that is yet." Tom smiled softly, his eyes filled with the same warmth she had come to depend on. "We've been running for so long. It's hard to think about what life looks like when we don't have to run anymore." Zara let out a soft laugh. "Exactly. I don't even know where to start." Before Tom could respond, Valeria appeared, her long coat trailing behind her as she made her way toward them. There was a slight swagger in her step, a confidence that Zara knew came from knowing she had helped topple a powerful enemy and emerge victorious. "Well, look at you two," Valeria said, her voice laced with amusement. "I'm impressed. You didn't just survive, you won." Zara shrugged, but she couldn't help the small smile that tugged at her lips. "Couldn't have done it without you." Valeria waved a hand dismissively. "I just gave you the tools. You're the ones who made it happen." She studied them for a moment, her sharp eyes taking in their exhaustion, their relief. "So, what now? You're free. You've got a ship. You've got your lives back. What are you going to do with all that freedom?" Zara hesitated, the question hanging between them like a weight. She hadn't figured that out yet, and the idea of making plans felt almost overwhelming. She had spent so much time reacting to the danger around her that thinking about the future seemed strange. "I don't know," Zara admitted, "but we're going to find out." Valeria nodded, her expression unreadable. "Well, if you ever need a smuggler or someone who knows how to keep their head in a fight, you know where to find me." She turned to go, but then paused, her voice softening for a moment. "You did good, Zara. You fought for your freedom. Don't forget what that means." With that, Valeria disappeared into the crowd, leaving Zara and Tom alone once more. Zara stared after her, a strange feeling of closure settling over her. She had fought for her freedom. That much was true. But now that she had it, what was she supposed to do with it? Later that evening, back aboard their freighter, Zara and Tom stood in the cockpit, staring out at the stars. The station was behind them, and the vast expanse of the galaxy stretched out before them like an invitation. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was no fear in Zara's heart, only possibility. "We could go anywhere," Tom said, his voice filled with wonder. "The galaxy's ours." Zara smiled, leaning against the control panel as she watched the stars. "Yeah, anywhere." For a long moment, they stood in silence, letting the weight of their choices sink in. They could go anywhere, do anything, and for the first time, Zara realized that she wasn't afraid of the future. She wasn't afraid of what came next, because she wasn't running anymore. "We could help people," Zara said after a while, her voice thoughtful. "People like us. People who've been trapped, betrayed, sold. There are still so many who haven't had a chance to fight for their freedom." Tom looked at her, admiration shining in his eyes. "You really want to do that?" Zara nodded, her heart steady with resolve. "Yeah, we have a ship, we have each other, and we know what it's like. We could make a difference." Tom smiled, his hand reaching out to take hers. "I'm with you. Wherever we go, whatever we do, I'm with you." Zara felt the warmth of his hand in hers, the connection that had grown between them through every fight, every struggle. They weren't just two people trying to survive anymore. They were partners, stronger together than they had ever been alone. Together, they had taken down a syndicate. Together, they had won their freedom. And now, together, they would shape their future. Zara turned back to the control panel, her hand hovering over the star map. The galaxy was vast, and there were still so many people who needed help. So many battles to fight. But this time, they wouldn't be running. "We'll start out there," Zara said, pointing toward a distant system on the map. "I hear there's a colony that's been dealing with some trouble, raiders, slavers. We could help." Tom grinned, his eyes bright with excitement. "Sounds like a good place to start." Zara punched in the coordinates, her heart light with the thrill of the unknown. The freighter's engines rumbled to life, and the stars began to blur as they set a course for their next adventure. As the ship sailed into the dark expanse of space, Zara felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. The storm of the past was behind them, and the future was wide open. A new dawn had come, and with it, the promise of something greater than survival. Together, they were more than just fugitives. They were free, and no matter where the stars took them, Zara knew one thing for certain. They would face whatever came next with courage, with hope, and with the unbreakable bond they had forged in the fire of battle. For the first time in her life, the future wasn't something to fear. It was something to embrace. And Zara was ready. Years passed, and Zara and Tom's names became legend across the galaxy. They had traveled far and wide, helping those who had been forgotten, freeing the enslaved, and fighting back against the corrupt forces that sought to control the weak. They were known as the Starbound, champions of the oppressed, warriors for freedom. Together, they built a network of allies, smugglers, fighters, and freedom seekers from every corner of the galaxy. And as their influence grew, so did their mission. They were no longer just running from their pasts. They were shaping the future. But no matter how far they traveled, how many battles they won, or how many lives they changed, one thing remained constant: the bond between Zara and Tom. Their love, forged in the darkest moments of their lives, had become a beacon of hope for those around them. And as they sailed through the stars, side by side, they knew one thing for certain: they had fought for their freedom, and they would continue fighting, not just for themselves, but for every soul in the galaxy who deserved to be free. Because together, they were unstoppable, and the stars had never shone brighter.